It was the kind of night New York wasn't supposed to forget, yet it wanted to. February of 1946, the harbor lights cut across the black water, throwing glimmers on the waves as a ship prepared to leave. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and somewhere between the click of a shutter and the sigh of a winter breeze, a man known as Charles "Lucky" Luciano turned his back on the skyline he once ruled. They didn't let him walk free. They didn't let him stay in the city he had built with fear, charm, and blood. Instead, they placed him on a ship bound for exile, sending him back to a homeland that wasn't his home anymore. They said it was mercy, a deal cut in silence. He had helped America during the war, given them protection on the docks, kept saboteurs away from ships, and provided intelligence that made Allied landings smoother in Sicily. For that, the government repaid him by opening the prison doors. But freedom came at a cost. America would never welcome him again. On the pier, men in trench coats pretended they weren't watching, FBI agents, naval officers, immigration officials, all of them trying to look professional. Yet beneath the surface, they carried a strange fear. Because when you stood near Lucky Luciano, you felt a kind of pull, the aura of a man who'd once decided life and death with a phone call. He wasn't the biggest, wasn't the loudest, but he had something more dangerous: vision. And vision never leaves a man. As the ship creaked and its ropes were loosened, Luciano lit a cigarette. He exhaled slow, like time itself had slowed with him. The smoke curled into the cold air, blurring the outline of New York's skyline, the Empire State, the Chrysler, all those towers of glass and stone that had watched him climb to power and crash into prison. He didn't flinch. Didn't look back twice. But in his chest, there was a wound deeper than any knife could make. To the newspapers, this was justice. To the police, this was relief. To his enemies in New York, this was opportunity. But to Luciano, it was theater. The Americans thought they had ended his story. They thought deportation was a full stop, a neat conclusion to the career of the man who had built the modern mafia. Yet Lucky knew something they didn't: legends don't stay in prison cells, and they don't vanish at sea. Legends travel. Legends adapt. Legends survive. For a brief moment, the harbor fell silent. Even the gulls circling above seemed to hold back their cries. In that silence, Luciano allowed himself a thought, half memory, half prophecy. He remembered the tenements of the Lower East Side when he was just a poor Sicilian kid named Salvatore, hustling pennies, dreaming of silk suits and respect. He remembered the betrayal of friends and the smell of gunpowder in dark stairwells. And he thought about Naples, the city he hadn't seen since he was a child. Was it waiting for him? Or was it a grave dressed up as a hometown? The ship horn blared, shattering the silence. The sound rolled across the water like a warning. A few reporters scribbled notes, a few bystanders shouted curses, but most simply watched. They wanted to see how a king fell. Luciano, however, didn't give them the satisfaction. He walked the deck with the calm grace of a man boarding not a ship, but a stage. Every step said the same thing: you think it's over, but you'll hear my name again. Inside his mind, thoughts moved like chess pieces. Who could he trust in Italy? Would the old Sicilian families respect him or resent him? Could Naples, scarred by war, give him the kind of power America had stripped away? And most importantly, who among his friends back in New York would now try to claim his throne? The pacing of the night was deceptive. To the world, it seemed like the curtain was closing. Yet in reality, a new act was beginning. America was tired of him, Italy barely remembered him, but Luciano's story wasn't finished. A gangster doesn't retire when governments sign papers. A gangster only retires when the heart stops beating or when someone else makes sure it does. As the boat pulled away, the skyline grew smaller, swallowed by fog. The sound of Manhattan traffic faded, replaced by the rhythm of waves against the hull. Luciano leaned against the rail, eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once. Maybe he was thinking of Meyer Lansky, the brain who had balanced his muscle. Maybe of Frank Costello, the smooth talker who'd become a politician in a gangster's suit. Or maybe he thought of Vito Genovese, the snake waiting for his chance to strike. Whatever passed through his mind, one thing was clear: Charles Lucky Luciano was gone from America, but not forgotten. Not yet. The newspapers could call it exile. The courts could call it justice. But in the underworld, in whispers passed in smoky bars and backroom card games, they called it something else. They called it opportunity. And so the ship carried him away, not just across the ocean, but across the line between power and memory, empire and exile. The night America let him go was not the night he was finished. It was the night he became something different, something untouchable. It was the night his legend set sail. When the ship finally touched Italian soil, Luciano felt the air was heavier than he remembered. Naples was not the city of his childhood memories, not the romantic Italy sung about in songs or painted in old photographs. This was 1946 Naples, scarred, weary, beaten down by years of war and occupation. The cobblestones carried the echo of boots, first German, then Allied. The people carried the weight of hunger in their eyes. And the harbor, once a place of commerce and laughter, now reeked of black markets and desperation. As he walked down the gangplank, men stared. Some recognized the name whispered through decades of gangster lore: Luciano, the American boss. Others saw only another deported criminal, another man with a sharp suit and sharp eyes. But everyone could sense it: there was something in the way he carried himself, a calm command, as though the chaos around him bent to his stride. Even exile couldn't strip him of that aura. Naples at that moment was a city suspended between ruin and rebirth. Bomb craters marked entire neighborhoods, and buildings leaned like tired men after a long shift. Women sold contraband cigarettes out of aprons, boys hustled chocolate and nylons from American soldiers still stationed nearby. The local Camorra, Naples' own version of organized crime, thrived in this chaos, running smuggling rings, ration scams, and black market trades. To them, the arrival of Lucky Luciano was both threat and promise. He was an outsider, yes, but also a man whose name carried weight across the Atlantic. For some, he was an asset waiting to be tapped; for others, he was a storm rolling into their fragile balance of power. Luciano noticed everything. He noticed how the alleys whispered with deals made in shadows, how children no older than 10 carried packages heavier than themselves, how the smell of roasted chestnuts mingled with the stench of sewage. This was not New York's Lower East Side, though it reminded him of it: the poverty, the hunger, the sense that survival meant bending the rules or breaking them altogether. He had once been that child, running errands for gang bosses, dreaming of silk ties and respect. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, he had returned to a place where boys with his hunger still roamed, except this time, he was the ghost of their possible future. Authorities in Naples kept a close eye on him from the first day. American intelligence didn't trust him. Italian officials resented him. They posted policemen outside his hotels, shadowed his walks, and checked on every guest who dared visit him. To them, he was a contaminant, a man whose influence might poison the already unstable recovery of post-war Italy. But surveillance was only part of the story. To the poor, the broken, and the desperate, Luciano represented something else entirely: a figure of power in a world where power was scarce. He rented rooms in luxury hotels, sometimes at the Excelsior, sometimes at the Royal. He entertained, smoked, read the newspapers, and played the role of a man unbothered. But behind the polished demeanor, his mind was restless. Naples was not just a cage, it was also a chessboard. Every conversation he overheard, every handshake he exchanged, was another piece placed on the board. The Camorra ran smuggling. He studied their routes. The Americans stationed nearby traded favors. He noted which officers looked greedy. Naples was poor, but poverty had always been the soil in which his kind of empire grew. Still, there was a shadow of disappointment that clung to him. He had once ruled New York, the city that defined modern power, the capital of ambition. Now he was here, in a city that looked like it was bleeding from every brick. The contrast was brutal. In Manhattan, neon signs once bent to his will; here, candles burned in dark alleys for lack of electricity. In New York, he had an army of soldiers and lieutenants; in Naples, he had hotel clerks who watched him suspiciously and policemen who followed too closely. Exile, he realized, was not just distance. It was disarmament. And yet, Luciano was not the kind of man to surrender. He spoke to locals, to businessmen scarred by war, to smugglers moving goods through the harbor. Always polite, always measured, he never demanded respect; he let it flow naturally, like water toward gravity. The Camorra bosses eyed him with caution. Some said, "This man can open doors back to America." Others whispered, "He will take more than he gives." The tension simmered beneath the surface like a pot waiting to boil. At night, when the city streets grew quieter, Luciano walked the balconies of his hotel and stared at the Mediterranean. The waves reminded him of the Atlantic crossing he had just made, the ocean that now stood like a wall between him and the empire he had built. He wondered if America still remembered him. He knew Meyer Lansky would. Frank Costello, too. But he also knew New York was a hungry city; it devoured the old and crowned the new. How long before his name was spoken less like a command and more like a memory? The pacing of his days in Naples shifted between monotony and tension. One morning he might be drinking espresso in a cafe, ignored by locals too busy chasing survival. By evening, police cars might idle outside his door, engines humming like a warning. He was free, but every hour reminded him this freedom was a leash and Naples was the tether. Still, as he lay awake in the early mornings, Luciano allowed himself a dangerous thought: Naples could be more than exile. Naples could be opportunity. This was a city hungry, broken, desperate. And desperation had always been his ally. The Americans thought they had sent him away to die in obscurity. But as the church bells of Naples tolled through the ruined streets, Luciano began to see something else entirely: a new stage, smaller than New York but no less ripe for a man who had once taught the world how to build empires out of shadows. For Naples, his return was a reminder that crime doesn't vanish with war, it adapts. For Luciano, it was the beginning of a new chapter. He had been deported, but he was not defeated. Not yet. The cradle of shadows had received him, and though the city seemed broken, its cracks only gave him places to hide, to move, to plan. And as he looked out across the dim harbor lights, lucky Luciano whispered a truth to himself that no government, no court, and no exile could erase: legends don't need thrones. They only need a stage. And Naples had just given him one. They called him a king without a kingdom, and in many ways, that was true. For Charles Lucky Luciano, exile in Naples was both freedom and imprisonment, a paradox he carried in every step. He walked streets where his name meant little, yet everywhere he went, whispers followed. Some whispered with curiosity, some with fear, others with resentment. But they all whispered, because even stripped of his empire, Luciano still carried himself like a man who ruled. His life in Naples settled into a rhythm that outsiders mistook for idleness. He rented the finest rooms in the best hotels, sometimes the Excelsior, sometimes the Royal Palace. He dined at restaurants where the silver still shone, even if the city outside was crumbling. He wore tailored suits, shine shoes, silk ties. To the casual eye, it looked like the life of a man resigned to leisure, a gangster playing aristocrat. But those who understood him, those who had known him in New York, knew better. Luciano never wasted time. Every dinner was a test, every conversation a probe, every gesture a signal. He might have been caged in Naples, but even cages can be made into command posts. He entertained visitors constantly. Some were old associates passing through Europe, others were opportunists hoping to tap into his legend. A few were spies wearing the disguise of friends. Luciano played host with elegance, offering cigars, pouring wine, smiling with that calm charm that had disarmed judges and rivals alike. But behind the smile was calculation. He weighed every word, every glance. He knew who came to him out of loyalty and who came because they smelled weakness. The authorities shadowed him relentlessly. Police agents sat in cars outside his hotels, followed him down cobblestone streets, reported on who entered his suites. Americans in Rome demanded regular updates. What was Luciano doing? Who was he meeting? What was he planning? The irony was bitter. In prison, he had been left alone to rot. In freedom, he was never alone at all. Yet Luciano understood this game. Surveillance was not just about control, it was also about intimidation. They wanted him to feel smaller, watched, irrelevant. He refused to give them that satisfaction. Every morning, he walked with dignity, carrying himself as though the men trailing him were not watchdogs but bodyguards. In the quiet of his rooms, however, the truth pressed harder. Letters from America carried news of shifting loyalties. Vito Genovese, the man who had once been his subordinate, was weaving his way into power. Frank Costello, once the voice of moderation, was balancing politics and underworld business with increasing success. Meyer Lansky, his old partner in thought and numbers, was still running operations with cold precision. And here he was, cut off, an ocean away, forced to watch his empire evolve without him. It was not just a matter of business, it was identity. Luciano had spent his entire life climbing. From a street kid on the Lower East Side to the architect of the commission, the man who reshaped the American Mafia from a chaotic street gang into a corporate structure. He had been more than a gangster, he had been an innovator. And now he was reduced to sitting in hotel lobbies, flipping through newspapers, scanning for mentions of his name. Some days, he was there. Most days, he wasn't. The king was becoming a footnote. Still, the power of memory worked in his favor. When he walked into a room, men straightened their ties. When he shook a hand, it carried a weight others couldn't imitate. Even those who doubted his influence felt compelled to show respect. The legend of Lucky Luciano was alive, even if the man himself was trapped in exile. Legends, after all, are hard to exile. The Camorra remained cautious. Their world was Naples, and they guarded it fiercely. Luciano, though Sicilian by birth, was still the American. Some saw him as an opportunity to bridge networks between Italy and the US. Others feared he would attempt to take control, to overshadow them. Meetings were arranged in backrooms, conversations carried in half sentences. Luciano listened more than he spoke, a tactic that always served him well. He didn't need to force himself into their operations, he only needed to make himself indispensable. Evenings brought him moments of solitude, the kind that turned his thoughts inward. He would sit by the window of his suite, cigarette glowing in the dark, staring at the city below. He thought of the nights in New York, when the city seemed to pulse with his heartbeat, when cabaret lights and neon signs marked the rhythm of his rise. Naples was quieter, broken. But in that silence, Luciano found a strange kind of reflection. He wondered about the choices that had brought him here. The friends betrayed. The enemies eliminated. The deals cut in whispers and sealed in blood. Was this the cost of vision? Was exile the price every king eventually paid? But reflection never dulled his instincts. Luciano remained sharp, alert. Every knock on his door, every sudden silence in a hallway, every unfamiliar face made him cautious. He trusted few. He had learned long ago that betrayal was not an accident in his world, it was tradition. And though far from New York, he knew that enemies could reach across oceans if they were determined enough. The pacing of his days shifted between calm and tension. Some mornings, the city felt almost peaceful. The sun shone across the bay, children played in the rubble of bombed-out buildings, church bells rang. For a moment, exile seemed almost like retirement, a chance to breathe after decades of war in the shadows. But then came the nights when footsteps trailed him too closely, when faces lingered too long in doorways, when news from America reminded him that power never rests. Peace, he realized, was an illusion he could never afford. And yet, despite the cage, despite the distance, despite the constant eyes upon him, Luciano carried himself as if he was still the boss. Because in his mind, he always would be. You could strip him of territory, deny him entry to America, keep him under guard in Naples. But you could not erase the blueprint he had carved into the underworld. Every family in New York still operated under the structure he had created. Every meeting of the commission, every deal struck in backrooms echoed with his vision. Even in exile, Luciano's fingerprints marked the world he left behind. The forgotten king in exile was not truly forgotten. He was remembered in whispers, feared in shadows, and watched with suspicion by governments who claimed he was finished. And Luciano knew one truth better than anyone: a man is never finished as long as his name still has power. And his name, Charles Lucky Luciano, still echoed like thunder across oceans. Exile was supposed to mean silence, a slow fading into obscurity. But Lucky Luciano had no intention of being silenced. Even from Naples, his mind stretched across oceans, pulling at strings in Havana, New York, and beyond. And in 1946, the world witnessed the boldest demonstration that exile didn't mean irrelevance: the Havana Conference, a gathering unlike any the underworld had ever seen. Havana was not just another city, it was a paradise built for indulgence. Casinos glittered, cabarets pulsed with music, the smell of rum and cigars hung heavy in the air. American tourists flooded the island, looking for pleasures forbidden back home. And behind that carnival facade, the Mafia saw opportunity. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, all could be managed, taxed, and controlled. And the man who envisioned it all, who still had the authority to summon the most powerful mob figures in the world, was none other than Lucky Luciano. He could not enter America. But Cuba was close enough, and through careful deals and political bribes, he made Havana his stage. Word spread quietly, then loudly: Luciano was hosting a meeting. And not just any meeting, this was to be a summit of bosses, a true underworld conference where the future of organized crime would be written. In December of 1946, Havana's grand hotels filled with men whose names alone carried weight like gunfire: Frank Costello, smooth-talking diplomat of the Mafia; Albert Anastasia, feared lord of Murder Incorporated; Joe Adonis, sharp dresser, sharper operator. And most striking of all, Meyer Lansky, the brain behind the numbers, a man whose loyalty to Luciano was both personal and practical. They gathered not as scattered gangs but as shareholders in a criminal corporation, ready to listen to the architect who had once united them. The atmosphere was electric. Imagine the lobby of the Hotel Nacional, silk suits brushing against marble columns, bodyguards posted at every corner, the faint music of a Cuban band drifting in from the courtyard. Reporters knew something was happening but couldn't quite grasp the scale. To the casual tourist, it looked like Havana was hosting a party of wealthy businessmen. To those in the know, it was the gathering of an empire reborn. Luciano, despite his exile, commanded the room with quiet authority. He had no need for loud speeches. His presence was enough to remind everyone that he was still the man who had designed the very structure of the Mafia. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. He told them gambling was the foundation, but narcotics, that was the future. Heroin and cocaine could flow from Europe, through Cuba, directly into the hungry veins of American cities. The profits would dwarf even the gambling halls of Havana. Some hesitated. Drugs carried more heat, more law enforcement, more moral outrage. But Luciano's logic was undeniable. America was booming after the war, its appetite for pleasure insatiable. And addicts, unlike gamblers, never walked away even after losing everything. To the bosses around him, the plan sounded like destiny. To Luciano, it was survival, a way to prove that even from exile, he could dictate the future of crime in America. Not all agreed, of course. Vito Genovese, sly and ambitious, maneuvered behind the scenes, spreading doubt about whether Luciano's time had passed. He argued that Lucky had been gone too long, that New York needed leadership on its own soil. But Genovese was not in Havana. He was in America, plotting. And his absence only reminded the others that while Luciano might be in exile, his reach still stretched far enough to call them together. The climax of the Havana conference came when Luciano reminded everyone of the old order, the commission he had created, the system of checks and balances that had brought stability to the underworld. He reminded them of the chaos before him, when gangs waged wars that left streets soaked in blood. You want to go back to that? His voice seemed to ask calm, but edged with warning. No one in that room wanted the old chaos. No one wanted to gamble against Luciano's memory. For several nights, Havana pulsed with this quiet storm. Dinners at private tables, whispered deals in smoke-filled lounges, toasts made with fine rum while orchestras played. Outside, the city danced in its usual rhythm, oblivious to the fact that the criminal blueprint of the next decade was being drafted in its hotels. But paradise never lasts. The Americans caught wind of what was happening. Newspapers sniffed at rumors, and government agents began to pressure Cuban officials. President Batista, once friendly to Mafia money, found the heat unbearable. Under U.S. insistence, Cuban authorities suddenly changed their tune. In a matter of weeks, Luciano went from honored guest to unwanted foreigner. The police came knocking, the visas evaporated, and the man who thought he had built a new empire in Havana found himself once again forced out. The betrayal stung, though he hid it well. This was supposed to be his resurgence, the proof that exile hadn't tamed him. And for a brief, shining moment, it had been. He had stood before the bosses, had reminded them who he was, had steered the conversation toward heroin, toward profits that would ripple for decades. But as he boarded another ship, escorted off the island like an inconvenience, Luciano felt the cage closing in again. Havana had given him a glimpse of resurrection, then snatched it away. Still, even in failure, Havana left a mark. The drug trade he had championed took root, spreading from Marseille to New York, from Naples to Harlem. His fingerprints were on every shipment, every deal, even if his hands never touched the product. Havana proved one thing beyond doubt: exile might keep his body away from America, but his vision was unstoppable. As the Cuban coastline faded from view, Luciano leaned once more against a railing, the sea stretching endlessly before him. He had tasted power again, had felt the respect, the fear, the loyalty. But now he was heading back to Naples, the cage with no bars. And somewhere, in the shadows of his thoughts, he wondered, how many more times could he escape the tide of betrayal, the tide of history? For the moment, the empire was reborn. But rebirth is fragile. And in Luciano's world, rebirth often came hand in hand with betrayal. Naples welcomed him not with parades, but with the heavy silence of a city that had survived war and carried scars in its cobblestones. Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship with the look of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. The Havana dream had dissolved quicker than smoke in the Caribbean wind, and now Naples was both his home and his prison. Exile meant he could breathe the air of Italy, but it also meant he was shackled to a place he had never wanted to rule. The irony was cruel. Luciano had reshaped the American underworld, built a system that carried his fingerprints on every dollar, every shipment, every roll of dice. Yet now he stood in a city where the local Camorra looked at him not as a king, but as an outsider. Naples was not New York. Its alleys carried whispers of old vendettas, its underworld was fragmented, suspicious of foreigners, even one who had been born on Italian soil. To them, Luciano was a man who had left, who had chosen America. And in the old world, loyalty was measured in roots, not in accomplishments across the ocean. Still, Naples could not ignore him. The American authorities had made sure his name arrived before he did, branding him a dangerous exile, a figure too powerful to be left unwatched. The Italian police shadowed his every move. They parked cars outside his modest apartment, followed him to cafes, noted every visitor who dared to share an espresso with him. It was surveillance that felt almost comical to Luciano. After all, he had once walked through New York knowing half the cops were on his payroll. Here, there were no envelopes of cash slipped under tables. Here, he was a watched man, powerless in the eyes of the law, but still feared in the whispers of the streets. Day after day, he walked the narrow lanes of Naples, watching children play football with ragged balls, old women hanging laundry from balconies, the faint smell of the sea carried on the wind. He felt the pull of nostalgia, but it was nostalgia for a life he had never really lived. Luciano had left Italy as a child. His rise, his empire, his legend, those belonged to America. Naples was a birthplace, not a kingdom. And yet here he was, caged not by bars but by borders, his world reduced to a handful of streets. But even cages have cracks. Luciano was not a man who accepted irrelevance. Slowly, carefully, he began to weave himself into Naples' shadows. The Camorra had its own codes, its own bosses, but they could not ignore the fact that Luciano had access to things they did not: connections with New York, Havana, Marseille. Through whispers and meetings arranged under the cloak of night, he began to re-establish a network. His focus was heroin. Europe was flooded with morphine after the war, and through contacts in Marseille, shipments could flow to Naples, and from there across the Atlantic. Yet even as he built these invisible strings, Luciano felt the weight of isolation. In New York, he had been surrounded by lieutenants who understood his rhythm, men like Lansky and Costello, who could anticipate his thoughts. In Naples, he was surrounded by strangers, watchful allies, but never trusted friends. The Camorra respected his name but not his throne. And in the quiet hours of the night, sitting by a window overlooking the Gulf of Naples, Luciano would light a cigarette and let the smoke curl upward, asking himself whether he was a ruler or simply a ghost of one. The Americans did not make things easier. They sent agents to question him, to monitor him, to remind him that he would never set foot in New York again. They feared his influence even from afar, believing every crime wave in the States had Luciano's shadow behind it. Perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. Even from exile, his advice traveled across oceans, coded through letters carried by couriers who swore loyalty. Orders spoken in hushed Italian cafes found their way into the veins of Harlem and the docks of Brooklyn. His cage had no bars, but his voice still seeped through the cracks. Still, the bitterness never left him. Naples was vibrant, alive, yet to him it always felt like a stage without an audience. He was a man used to ruling in neon and shadow, in the booming chaos of American cities. Here, he was surrounded by reminders of what he had lost. He could stroll by the sea, dine on pasta and wine, watch the sun set in warm colors over Vesuvius, but none of it replaced the electric hum of Manhattan nights, the deals whispered in smoky backrooms, the respect of men who knew his power firsthand. And so, Naples became a contradiction, freedom and imprisonment intertwined. He was no longer behind walls, but every step reminded him he had been banished from the only kingdom that truly mattered. His cage was invisible, yet it held him tighter than any prison cell ever could. But Luciano had always been a survivor. Even as exile gnawed at him, he clung to one truth: empires may lose their thrones, but they never lose their foundations. And somewhere beyond the sea, his empire still whispered his name. Naples might have caged him, but he was not finished yet. The streets of New York did not mourn Lucky Luciano the way he might have imagined when he was forced onto that ship. There were no statues toppled, no crowns scattered in the gutter. The city was a living beast, and when one king was removed, another rose to fill the vacuum. For Luciano, watching from afar, that replacement came in the form of a man he knew all too well: Vito Genovese. Genovese had always been ambitious enough to follow Lucky when it suited him, and ambitious enough to betray him when the winds shifted. Back in the 1930s, Genovese had played the role of loyal underboss, nodding along to Lucky's vision of a modern organized crime syndicate. He smiled when Lucky spoke of structure, of a commission that would settle disputes like businessmen instead of bloodthirsty street brawlers. But behind that smile was hunger. Genovese wanted what Lucky had. The difference was that where Lucky carried charm, Vito carried menace. Where Luciano believed in negotiation, Genovese believed in intimidation. When Lucky was deported, Vito seized his chance. He returned from Italy after the war, slipping back into the American underworld with the patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. His timing was perfect. Frank Costello, who had kept the family running in Luciano's absence, preferred politics to bloodshed. Costello was known as the Prime Minister, greasing palms, shaping laws, making the mob respectable in a way that soothed society's fears. But respectability breeds vulnerability. To men like Genovese, it smelled of weakness. Luciano, sitting in a cafe in Naples, would hear of Genovese's movements through whispered reports carried by travelers and letters written in codes. The words were clinical, but the meaning was sharp. Genovese was consolidating power, whispering in ears, planting seeds of doubt. The empire Lucky had built, the commission, the structure, the rules, was slowly bending to another man's will. And this man was not a builder like Luciano. He was a usurper, a conqueror who took pleasure in chaos. In Naples, Lucky's nights stretched longer with each update. He could almost hear Vito's gravelly voice across the Atlantic, spreading poison. Luciano's finished. He's nothing but an exile sipping espresso in the old country. The streets belong to us now. It wasn't the loss of power that cut deepest, it was betrayal. Luciano had lifted men like Genovese from the gutters, given them seats at his table, carved them into history. And now one of those men was dismantling that very table piece by piece, while Lucky could only watch. The betrayal carried an echo of personal insult. For Luciano, loyalty had always been currency. He could forgive mistakes, forgive weakness, but betrayal was the one sin that stayed like a knife in the ribs. Vito had broken that code, and worse, he was thriving. Luciano, for all his cunning, could not change geography. He was stuck in Naples, under constant surveillance, while Genovese maneuvered freely through the alleys of Manhattan and the polished halls of New Jersey mansions. And yet, the rise of Genovese was not smooth. His ambition was too naked, too brutal. He made enemies as quickly as he gathered allies. The moment he returned to America, he set about undermining Costello, whispering that the old boss was too soft, too cozy with politicians, too far removed from the raw business of the streets. But Costello was not blind. He had allies of his own, and his alliance with Meyer Lansky gave him access to a mind just as sharp as Luciano's. For a time, the two camps existed in uneasy balance, the politicians' mob under Costello and Lansky, and the predators' mob under Genovese. Lucky, hearing of this, felt the bitter taste of irony. His grand vision of the commission was supposed to prevent exactly this, endless infighting, families tearing themselves apart for scraps of power. Yet here it was, repeating like history never learned. Without his steady hand, the balance was tilting toward bloodshed. It wasn't long before that blood was spilled. In 1957, Costello walked into the lobby of his Manhattan apartment building. A man stepped from the shadows and raised a gun. The shot rang out, grazing Costello's head but not killing him. It was a warning, not an execution. The message was clear: step aside, or the next bullet will not miss. Costello, ever the pragmatist, stepped down. He had survived too long to throw his life away in a feud he knew could not be won. Genovese had won. When news of this reached Luciano in Naples, it felt like watching his empire crumble in slow motion. The throne he had designed for successors who would rule with cunning and restraint had been seized by a man who understood neither. For Luciano, the sting wasn't just that Genovese had taken power, it was that he had done so in Luciano's absence, while the once great boss was caged in exile, powerless to act. But exile does strange things to men. It sharpens their bitterness, deepens their reflections. In the silence of his Neapolitan nights, Luciano would recall the nights in New York when Genovese would sit at his side, listening intently, pretending to absorb the wisdom of a visionary. Maybe the betrayal had always been inevitable. Maybe men like Genovese were never capable of loyalty, only obedience until the moment power was within reach. The tragedy for Luciano was not that he had lost to Genovese, but that he had created him. He had given Vito the tools, the connections, the very seat at the table that allowed him to rise. Now, as an exile looking back, Luciano understood what every ruler learns too late: sometimes the sharpest blade is the one you hand to your protege. Still, Luciano was not a man who wallowed. His anger simmered, but it also fueled him. He began to plot ways to undercut Genovese, even from across the sea. He whispered alliances with men who distrusted Vito's methods. He sent signals through the grapevine, reminders that though he was exiled, he was not gone. His cage had no bars, and his voice still carried across oceans. If Genovese thought the king had no reach, he was mistaken. And so the story shifted. In America, Vito Genovese walked with the swagger of a man who believed the crown was his. But in Naples, Lucky Luciano lit another cigarette, his mind already moving like a chessboard, plotting moves that would travel farther than any ocean could block. The betrayal had cut deep, but Luciano was not finished. And as history would prove, Genovese's victory would not last as long as he believed. It began with a dream of smoke curling over Havana's casinos, of dice rolling across velvet tables, of glasses clinking under chandeliers dripping with gold. For Lucky Luciano, exile was not supposed to be the end. Exile was just another move in a long game, another shuffle of the deck. And Havana was the card he believed could beat the house. From Naples, Luciano's mind stretched across the Atlantic toward Cuba. The island was already humming with opportunity in the late 1940s. The Americans poured in for sun, rum, and sin. The Cuban government was pliable, the cops were easily bought, and the casinos were sprouting like roses in desert soil. To Luciano, it smelled like New York in the old days, lawless, raw, waiting to be carved into an empire. Only this time, he wouldn't just be the king of a borough. He could be the silent emperor of an entire playground. Havana became the stage for his great gamble. He couldn't walk New York's streets anymore, but he could make Havana his boardroom. He reached out through old connections, Meyer Lansky, always the architect, always calculating, Frank Costello, still bruised but breathing after Genovese's attempted coup, and the Jewish syndicate men who knew how to turn vice into profit like alchemists turning dust into gold. The pieces began to align. By 1946, the legendary Havana Conference was set. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a coronation. The top bosses from across America flew down, dressed in summer suits, dripping with jewelry, their laughter echoing in the ballrooms of the Hotel Nacional. Havana, for one glittering week, became the capital of the underworld. And presiding over it, quietly but unmistakably, was the man in exile, Charles Lucky Luciano. The conference was cinematic in every sense. Rolls-Royces lined the driveway. Women in evening gowns fluttered like exotic birds. Every high roller in the hemisphere wanted a seat at the table. The bosses discussed heroin shipments from Europe, gambling profits from Cuba, and the future of organized crime under the shadow of American politics. And in every whispered conversation, Luciano's name carried weight. For the first time since his deportation, he was back, not in New York, but in the pulse of power. He had proved he wasn't finished. But like all gambits, the Havana dream carried risks. In the shadows of those casinos were eyes that could not be bought. American intelligence had ears on the island, and whispers of Luciano's presence trickled back to Washington. His return was too loud, too flamboyant. Exile had rules: you disappear, you fade, you never remind the crown who they dethroned. Luciano broke those rules the moment he stepped into Havana's golden spotlight. Worse, betrayal crept into the heart of the gathering. Vito Genovese had slipped into the conference like a serpent, carrying his own agenda. While Luciano envisioned Havana as a neutral empire, a place where the syndicate could profit without the blood feuds, Genovese saw it as another battlefield. He spread poison, whispering that Luciano's time was past, that his exile made him weak, that the real future of the mob lay not in distant Havana, but in the iron fist of the new bosses in New York. The tension was palpable. In one corner, Lansky painted Havana as the crown jewel, his words soft but convincing, describing profits so vast they seemed endless. In another, Genovese sneered, reminding the room that power was measured not by profits but by presence, by who walked the streets of Manhattan and commanded respect with a glance. Luciano tried to hold the balance, his voice carrying that mix of charm and menace that had once silenced entire rooms. But this was not New York, and Exile had stripped some of the fear from his name. Still, for a brief shining moment, the dream held. Money poured into Havana's casinos. Tourists flooded in, tossing cash like confetti. Luciano walked the hotels like a ghost king, unseen by most, but felt by all. Women leaned closer when he entered a room. Men lowered their voices when they caught sight of his figure in the shadows. He wasn't home, but he was alive again. And then, as quickly as it rose, the dream collapsed. Washington could not allow Havana to become the new capital of crime. American newspapers began to whisper of Luciano's presence on the island, portraying him as the dark hand behind every roulette wheel. The government applied pressure on Cuba, demanding action. The Cuban president, Batista, who had smiled and shaken hands, began to feel the heat. Havana was too small a stage to hold both America's appetite for control and Luciano's hunger for empire. The turning point came in 1947. U.S. officials threatened to cut off shipments of vital medicines to Cuba unless Batista expelled Luciano. The message was brutal in its simplicity: keep the exile, lose the lifeline. Batista folded. One morning, Cuban authorities arrived not with bullets but with papers. Luciano was escorted from the island, his dream of Havana folded into ashes. For Luciano, the humiliation was worse than the deportation years earlier. In New York, he had been banished by his enemies. But in Havana, he had been betrayed by his allies. Batista, once a partner, had chosen politics over loyalty. Lansky and Costello, for all their affection, could not protect him against Washington's iron grip. And Genovese stood in New York smirking, as if the entire Havana fiasco had been another step in his long plan to erase Luciano from history. The exile deepened. Back in Naples, Luciano sat in cafes with his cigarette in his memories, watching the sun set over a city that was never truly his. He thought of the velvet tables in Havana, the sound of dice rolling, the flash of cameras at the Hotel Nacional, the way men leaned in when he spoke. It had been so close, a rebirth, a resurrection. But like all gambles, it had turned on a single card. And this time, the house had won. Yet even in defeat, Luciano's mind kept spinning. Havana had collapsed, but the lesson was clear: exile did not mean irrelevance. The government could drag his body from Havana, but they could not silence the myth. The Havana Conference became legend, whispered about in bars and backrooms for decades. Lucky Luciano, the man they tried to bury, had stood again in the center of power, if only for a fleeting moment. In the shadows of Naples, he carried that memory like a flame. Betrayed, expelled, humiliated, but not erased. And as long as his name was spoken in Havana's casinos, in New York's alleys, in Washington's reports, he was not finished. Not yet. Respect, it was the currency Lucky Luciano had always traded in. Not just the kind that came from a gun pressed against a man's temple, or the threat of broken bones in an alleyway. No, Lucky knew a deeper kind of respect, the kind born out of admiration, the acknowledgement of power wrapped in charm, the willingness of men to follow him not only because they feared him but because they wanted to. But in exile in Naples, Lucky found himself confronting a cruel truth: respect and fear are not eternal. They fade, they shift, they cling to those who hold the stage at that very moment. And the stage had moved. New York was no longer his kingdom. Havana had been his last attempt to build a throne across the sea, and Washington had pulled the rug out from under him. Now, as he walked the streets of Naples, cigarette between his fingers, he had to reckon with the whispers: is Lucky still lucky? The neighborhood kids stared at him like he was a ghost. Older Italians who remembered the Mafia of Sicily and Naples didn't quite understand what he represented. He was too American for them, his accent, his clothes, his mannerisms. They saw him as an outsider, a man who had lived under neon lights and skyscrapers, now reduced to shadows in their narrow streets. To them, he wasn't a don. He was a deportee. A relic. And yet, in the United States, his name still sent ripples. Federal agents kept dossiers updated, tracking his every move, terrified he would weave himself back into the heart of the American underworld. Newspapers continued to print his story, sometimes painting him as a devil, sometimes as a fallen king. But the younger generation of mobsters, men like Carlo Gambino, men who had risen quietly, methodically, were starting to look at him differently. To them, he was history. A story you told in bars to explain where it all began. That was the sting. Lucky had built the commission, the very backbone of the American Mafia structure. He had given them rules, order, profit. And now, as he looked across the ocean, he could see the system thriving without him. The families were richer than ever, the rackets deeper, the politicians still bought and paid for. The machine he built no longer needed its architect. This is where the line between respect and fear blurred. Fear kept men obedient, but respect made them loyal. And loyalty, that was the one thing Lucky had always valued above all. He remembered the days when Meyer Lansky sat at his side, when Frank Costello carried his words like gospel, when even Bugsy Siegel, wild as he was, never doubted his leadership. Those men hadn't followed him because they had to, they followed him because they believed in him. But Genovese had ruled by fear. Genovese didn't care if men respected him, he wanted them to tremble. He wanted silence when he entered a room, obedience born from terror. And in New York, it was working. The streets buzzed with Genovese's name, with his schemes, with his ruthless consolidation of power. Luciano heard it all, read it in coded letters smuggled across the Atlantic. Each report was another knife, the commission that was once his now bent under the shadow of Vito Genovese. Late nights in Naples, Luciano would sit in dim cafes, his glass half full, and reflect. The world remembered him as a man of power, but he knew power was like smoke, it slipped through your fingers the moment you tried to hold it. Respect was the same. It didn't matter what you had done, it mattered what you were doing. Now. And Luciano, trapped in exile, wasn't doing anything. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender the myth. If New York's gangsters wanted to call him history, he would remind them that history had a way of haunting the present. He sent quiet messages back to America, subtle but deliberate, reminding them of his influence. He leaned on Lansky and Costello, reminding them of debts owed, of the foundation they still stood upon. And when whispers of heroin shipments passing through Sicily began to reach him, he listened carefully. Drugs had always been the new frontier, the business that divided men of vision from men of tradition. Luciano had once forbidden heroin, fearing it would draw too much heat. But now it looked like the one thing that could tie him back into the arteries of power. The irony was thick. The man who once promised to keep heroin out of the syndicate was now being whispered about as the silent hand behind the new European routes. American authorities certainly believed it. They accused him of orchestrating shipments across the Mediterranean, feeding the veins of New York junkies with Sicilian heroin. To the FBI, this was proof that Luciano was still pulling strings. To Luciano, it was something more complicated. The truth was blurred. He may not have been the mastermind they imagined, but he was no bystander either. He knew the men who controlled the ports. He had the respect of Sicilian bosses who saw in him an American brother. If he wasn't orchestrating the trade, he was at least shaping it with his presence. And so, slowly, respect began to return, but it was a different kind of respect. In Sicily and Naples, men began to seek him out not as a street boss but as a consigliere, a figure of wisdom. They wanted his counsel, his approval. They wanted to be able to say, Lucky Luciano blessed this deal. It wasn't the fiery respect of youth, born from ambition and violence. It was the quieter respect of age, of legacy. But even that came at a cost. Respect in exile was fragile. It depended on his myth, and myths could be broken. The Americans still hunted his name. The Italians still viewed him as an intruder. And the young bloods in New York were less and less inclined to look across the ocean for guidance. The line between respect and fear, Luciano felt it tightening around his throat. He wondered often which had been the stronger weapon in his life. Fear had built his empire quickly, but respect had held it together. Without fear, men eventually forgot you. Without respect, they betrayed you. Which was worse? To be feared but unloved? Or to be respected but forgotten? The thought haunted him as he aged. The mirror reflected not the dashing gangster of New York nights but an older man with tired eyes and creased skin. He was still lucky, yes. But time had a way of stripping even the luckiest of men bare. And yet, as he stared out over the Bay of Naples, smoke curling from his cigarette, he allowed himself a half-smile. Respect and fear might fade. But legend? Legend had a way of outliving them both. Sicily. To the outside world, it was a place of sun-drenched coastlines, vineyards rolling into the horizon, and centuries of history carved into its cobblestone streets. But to lucky Luciano, Sicily was something else entirely. It was both cradle and curse, the birthplace of the Mafia's myth and the place where whispers turned into empires. When he stepped onto Sicilian soil decades after his name first echoed across New York, he felt the pull of history like a chain around his neck. Sicily was where respect wasn't just demanded, it was bred into the blood. Here, the Mafia wasn't a syndicate or a commission. It wasn't the polished version Luciano had crafted in America with boardroom-style meetings and rules about territories. Here, it was primal. Family. Tradition. Vendetta. It was the kind of world where a man's word could bind generations, and where betrayal wasn't settled with contracts but with bullets left in the dirt beneath olive trees. For Luciano, stepping into the shadowy theater was like entering a mirror of his own past. The bosses here knew his reputation. They had heard stories from across the ocean of how Salvatore Lucania, the poor kid from Lercura Fritti who once begged for scraps in Naples, had gone to America and reshaped the Mafia into something vast, something modern. They admired that. But admiration was not the same as allegiance. Sicily had its own kings, its own hierarchies, its own bloodlines. Luciano was a son of the soil, yes, but he had become an American first. To them, he was half insider, half outsider. And that was dangerous. Still, the allure of power drew them together. In smoky backrooms of Palermo, in villas tucked away from the main roads, Luciano met with men whose names were spoken only in whispers. They wanted his guidance, his knowledge of the American machine. They wanted a bridge, a way to connect the old world to the new, Sicily's heroin markets to New York's streets. America was hungry, and Sicily could feed it. Luciano listened, always with that calm expression that had carried him through decades of danger. He weighed the offers carefully. He knew too well what drugs could do. Back in the 30s, he had resisted the heroin trade, not out of morality but out of pragmatism. Heroin was too dirty, too visible. It brought cops, federal raids, and headlines. But now heroin wasn't just temptation, it was inevitability. The demand in New York was surging, and younger gangsters didn't have his hesitation. If he refused, they would simply cut him out. So he played the game differently. He positioned himself as an advisor, not a dealer. He didn't touch the product, he didn't need to. Instead, he offered structure, contacts, and credibility. When Sicilian bosses wanted assurance that their shipments would find safe passage through American ports, Luciano's name was the stamp of approval. When American families wanted guarantees that their supply lines were secure, they trusted the man who had built the commission. He was the bridge. The shadow between two worlds. But shadows don't come without dangers. The Americans' FBI, Narcotics Bureau, even the CIA were watching him closely. Every rumor that tied Luciano to the heroin pipeline became a headline. Luciano at the center of international drug ring, the papers declared, even when no hard evidence existed. To the public, he was the villain returned, poisoning American youth from across the Atlantic. To Luciano, it was half amusement, half frustration. He knew the power of perception. If they painted him as the mastermind, maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe it kept his legend alive, kept men afraid to cross him. But it also meant eyes everywhere. Italian police trailed him. American agents sent cables back and forth. He couldn't move without suspicion shadowing his steps. In Sicily, the tension simmered. Rival factions debated how much they needed him. Some thought he was a relic, a man living off past glory. Others believed his name was a shield a way to unite Sicilian and American rackets under one silent banner. And Luciano? He navigated it with that signature mix of charm and menace, smiling when others frowned, letting silence stretch longer than comfort demanded, reminding them without words that he had survived where countless others had fallen. One evening in Palermo, during a gathering at a villa lit by flickering candles and the hum of cicadas outside, Luciano addressed a circle of young capos. His voice was low, steady, measured. He told them about New York in the 1920s, about the streets where Irish gangs clashed with Italians, where Jewish bootleggers struck deals in smoke-filled rooms, where men died over a block of territory. He told them how he had seen chaos, how he had built order. Respect and rules, he said, tapping the ash of his cigarette into a glass. Without those, this life burns out. You want power? You need structure. The young men leaned in, captivated. This wasn't just history, it was instruction. Luciano wasn't merely reminiscing, he was teaching. For him, this was the quiet satisfaction of legacy. He might never again sit at the commission table in New York, but here, in these Sicilian nights, he could shape the future by planting seeds in impressionable minds. Yet he also knew the price. The more his influence grew in Sicily, the more enemies he gathered. Old dons didn't like outsiders telling their sons how to think. And American authorities were tightening the noose, desperate to prove he was still the spider at the center of the web. Luciano had lived his life balancing respect and fear, loyalty and betrayal. Now, in Sicily, the stakes were no different, only the stage had changed. As he returned to Naples after each Sicilian visit, the reflection in his glass reminded him of the paradox: he was both everywhere and nowhere. His name crossed oceans, his legend filled books, his shadow stretched over 2 continents. But in reality, he was a man in exile, stripped of his home, always watched, never free. Still, the fire hadn't died. As he looked at the horizon over the Sicilian hills, Luciano allowed himself the faintest grin. Shadows may fade with the dawn. But in Sicily, shadows had always been eternal. They used to call him the boss of bosses, the man who had reshaped the American underworld into a functioning syndicate, a machine that operated smoother than most corporations. Yet here he was, pacing a modest apartment in Naples, staring out of a window onto a street where children kicked a ball against crumbling walls. Lucky Luciano, once the kingmaker of New York, the architect of the commission, now lived without a throne. For most men, exile would have been a death sentence. To be forced from the city that defined you, stripped of the empire you had built brick by brick in the shadows, and made to live as a ghost across the ocean, most men would have collapsed under the weight of irrelevance. But not Luciano. He didn't survive the streets of New York, prison on the rock, and betrayal from allies just to vanish quietly. No. Luciano's empire might have been taken, but his legend remained. And in the world he had helped design, sometimes the legend was more powerful than the throne itself. In Naples, life had a strange rhythm. Mornings came slow, filled with the aroma of espresso from neighborhood cafes, the chatter of market vendors, the scent of bread still warm from the oven. Luciano moved through it like a shadow, recognized by some, ignored by others. To the locals, he was simply another man who had returned from America, one of the countless sons who had crossed the ocean and later drifted back with lined faces and stories too dark to tell. But to anyone who truly knew the name, his presence in Naples was electric. American journalists whispered about him in their columns. Luciano was rebuilding his empire from the old country. Federal agents in New York obsessed over the cables reporting his movements. The Italian police shadowed him, documenting his lunches, his visitors, even the brand of cigarettes he smoked. They all believed he was still orchestrating the game. And maybe, in some ways, he was. But the truth was more complicated. Luciano was no longer the man giving orders at a table surrounded by capos. He was the ghost who haunted the corridors of power, the advisor whose mere nod could set plans into motion, the legend whose silence carried more weight than another man's speech. In these years, Luciano lived in contradiction. On one hand, he was trapped, without the ability to return to America, without the ability to stand in the open as the leader he once was. On the other hand, he was freer than ever. He had no official responsibilities, no territory to guard, no constant need to enforce his authority with blood. He could walk the streets of Naples, buy a newspaper, sit at a cafe, and know that while the world speculated endlessly about him, none of them truly knew his moves. For a man who had always thrived on ambiguity, this was its own kind of power. The tension lay in the heroin trade. By the 1950s, Sicily and Marseille were becoming epicenters of supply, and New York was starving for product. American families wanted assurance, Sicilian suppliers wanted connections, and Luciano's name was the bridge both sides trusted. Did he profit from it? Absolutely. Did he handle it with his own hands? Never. He was too smart for that. He operated in the spaces between where his influence mattered more than his presence, where men moved mountains simply because they believed Lucky Luciano expected it. That was the empire without a throne, invisible, intangible, but no less real. At night, when the city quieted and only the hum of scooters echoed through narrow alleys, Luciano would sit with a glass of red wine, staring at the ceiling as if seeing ghosts from his past. Meyer Lansky, his old partner, was still in America, still navigating the world of casinos and international finance. Frank Costello had grown into a different kind of power, brushing shoulders with politicians, becoming the prime minister of the underworld. They were living legacies of the empire they had built together. And Luciano? He was the exile. The man who had lost his country but not his identity. Did he resent them? Perhaps in fleeting moments. But mostly he understood. Every empire needed a sacrifice, and he had been chosen to carry that burden. The Americans still feared him, and that fear was its own form of control. They whispered that Luciano could destabilize entire markets with a single message, that his word could bring peace or chaos to the families still running the commission. Whether or not it was true didn't matter, what mattered was that they believed it. And Luciano knew that belief was power. He played into it masterfully, letting the silence feed the myth. But beneath that myth, there was also loneliness. No matter how many young capos in Sicily hung on his words, no matter how many reports were filed by agents tracking his every move, Luciano was a man living in exile. The empire was still there, but he couldn't sit at its table. He couldn't walk through Mulberry Street and feel the pulse of the neighborhood that had shaped him. He couldn't visit the commission and settle disputes with that cold, steady stare. He was everywhere and nowhere, an emperor without a crown, a king without a kingdom. Sometimes, when he walked through Naples in the early mornings before the streets filled with chatter, he thought about the irony of it all. He had built the Mafia into something global, something unshakable, yet he himself had been shaken loose from its heart. The machine kept turning, but he had been exiled to the edges of it. Was it a punishment? Was it fate? Or was it simply the price of greatness, that the man who built the empire must eventually live outside it, watching from the shadows? As the years stretched on, Luciano began to accept this paradox as his reality. He didn't need the throne to be remembered. He didn't need the power to know he had shaped history. His legacy was carved not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the very structure of organized crime, in the way it operated from coast to coast, from continent to continent. Long after he was gone, men would still follow the blueprint he had drawn. And in that sense, maybe the empire without a throne was the truest kind of empire, one that could outlive even the man who had created it. Luciano's days in Naples were a study in contrasts, quiet mornings and restless nights, small gestures hiding monumental influence, exile masking a silent reign. And though he never wore the crown again, he remained what he had always been, lucky. Not because fate spared him, not because chance saved him, but because he had mastered the art of survival. And survival, in his world, was the only throne that mattered. By the mid-1950s, Luciano's life had entered a strange twilight. The world around him had changed, but inside his circle of power and memory, the game never really ended. Naples had become his cage, but it was also his theater. Even as a man exiled, he played the role of an advisor whose shadow still touched continents. Yet everyone knew, friends, enemies, and lawmen alike, that every empire has its final act. And for Luciano, that act came in the shape of what would be called his last deal. He had always been connected to the drug trade, even if he denied it in public and shrugged it off with that smirk only he could manage. Heroin was becoming the new gold of the underworld, and Sicily stood at the center of its production routes. In America, the hunger for product was insatiable, and the commission families looked overseas for steady supply. They needed someone with credibility, someone who could bridge the gap between Sicilian suppliers and American buyers. And no name commanded more instant trust than Lucky Luciano's. Meetings were arranged in backrooms where espresso cups clinked softly against saucers and cigarette smoke curled to the ceilings. Luciano would sit quietly, listening more than speaking, letting younger men argue over logistics, territories, and percentages. Then, at the right moment, he would speak calm, measured, his voice still carrying that authority of a man who had once reorganized the American Mafia itself. His word was final not because he enforced it with violence anymore, but because no one dared to question the architect of the commission. But the Americans had never stopped watching. Federal agents back in New York compiled dossiers thicker than novels, each page speculating about Luciano's influence from across the ocean. The press painted him as the mastermind of a global heroin empire, the spider at the center of an international web. Some of it was exaggeration, but Luciano didn't mind. The myth was as powerful as reality. If they believed he could still control the game, then he could still use that belief as leverage. Yet inside him, a quiet weariness was growing. He was no longer the man who had once stood on Mulberry Street, fearless and untouchable. His health was fading. Years of stress, late nights, and cigarettes had carved their mark. He often thought of what Meyer Lansky had become, more businessman than gangster, a man whose dealings in casinos gave him the appearance of legitimacy. He thought of Frank Costello, blending with senators and judges, carving power not with bullets but with influence. And then he thought of himself, stuck in exile, playing a role he could never fully leave behind. The last deal that haunted his final years was tied to heroin shipments moving from Sicily through Italy, bound for America's hungry markets. The press accused him of controlling it. Agents swore he was the invisible hand. And whether he was or not, Luciano never gave a clear answer. To admit it would mean confirming the fears of the world. To deny it would make him look irrelevant. So he did what he always did best, he let the ambiguity work in his favor. But this time, something was different. He wanted closure. For years, rumors had swirled about him returning to America, about secret negotiations with authorities, about trading information or influence for the chance to die on the soil where his empire was born. He wanted to stand once more on the streets of New York, to breathe in the city that had made him. But he knew it would never happen. The Americans would never allow it. He had been useful once, even indispensable during the war, but now he was just a liability. So he focused on the only thing he had left, control of his own ending. In early 1962, whispers began about meetings with an Italian film producer, a man who wanted to make a biopic about Luciano's life. The idea thrilled him. For decades, newspapers had written his story, twisting it into something between myth and monster. But what if he told it himself? What if he left behind a version of his story that he chose? He agreed to meet to discuss the details, and that meeting would become the stage for his final chapter. The day began like any other. Luciano dressed carefully, as always. Even in exile, even in old age, presentation mattered. His suit was pressed, his shoes shined. He carried himself with that same old dignity, the air of a man who had once commanded kings without ever sitting on a throne. As he walked through the streets of Naples, locals nodded with quiet recognition. They didn't see just a man, they saw the ghost of an empire, the living echo of a name whispered in both fear and admiration. The meeting took place at the airport. Luciano arrived calm, collected, with that half-smile he had always worn in moments of tension. He shook hands with the producer, exchanged pleasantries, and began discussing how the story of his life might be told on screen. He spoke of America, of the Commission, of betrayal, loyalty, and survival. For a moment, it seemed as if he was not a man in exile, but once again the mastermind shaping narratives, controlling the story, commanding attention. And then it happened. In mid-sentence, as he described a detail from his past, Luciano's chest tightened. Pain shot through him, sudden and merciless. His voice faltered. The color drained from his face. He clutched at his heart, staggered, and collapsed to the floor. Witnesses rushed to him, calling for doctors, but it was too late. Charles Lucky Luciano, who had survived knives, bullets, betrayals, and prisons, was taken not by violence, but by his own heart. At 64 years old, the man who had shaped the Mafia into a global machine had met his end in an airport, during a meeting about telling his story. It was an ending no screenwriter could have crafted better. The man who had spent his life controlling narratives, manipulating myth, and shaping reality had died in the middle of dictating his own version of events. The last deal he had ever made was not about drugs or money or power. It was about memory. About how history would remember Lucky Luciano. In the aftermath, the myths only grew stronger. Newspapers wrote dramatic headlines. Agents felt vindicated, believing the mastermind of global narcotics had finally fallen. Young gangsters whispered about him like a saint or a curse. Even in death, Luciano held power because his story was unfinished, his legend uncontainable. And maybe that was the real last deal, not the drugs, not the smuggling routes, not the whispered orders. The last deal was between Luciano and history. He had given the world a story so vast, so layered, so filled with shadows and half-truths that no one could ever fully untangle it. He had made himself eternal in the one way that mattered, through myth. For a man who had lived without a throne, it was the perfect ending. He didn't need a crown to be remembered. His empire had outlived him, and his story would never die. When Lucky Luciano's heart stopped beating on that day in 1962, it was not just the end of a man's life, it was the closing of a chapter in the saga of organized crime. But his story did not die with him. In fact, in many ways, it grew stronger. Death has a way of purifying memory, of sanding down the rough edges, of elevating men from mortals into myths. And Luciano, more than most, had spent a lifetime crafting a legend that would outlive his flesh. What he left behind was not only an empire but a framework, an invisible architecture of power that would shape the Mafia for generations. This was the true legacy of Lucky Luciano, the Commission. Before Luciano, the American Mafia had been a chaotic and bloody organism. Families fought without restraint, ambition erupted into violence, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. Bosses like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano had ruled by force and intimidation, their reigns punctuated by betrayal and bloodshed. Luciano had changed all of that. With the Commission, he had created something enduring, a system, a board of directors for organized crime where disputes could be resolved not by bullets but by votes, where power was balanced and shared, and where the organization could evolve like a living, breathing corporation. And it worked. Even after his exile, even after his death, the Commission remained the backbone of Mafia structure in America. The five families of New York, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo would continue to operate with the Commission as their supreme court. Disputes between families in Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, or New Orleans could be brought before it. The Mafia was no longer just a loose collection of gangs, it was an institution. It had rules, traditions, and an order that made it harder to destroy. That order was Luciano's fingerprint. In the years following his death, the underworld both revered and feared his name. To young gangsters rising in the 1960s and 1970s, Luciano was a legend. His story was whispered in social clubs, told like gospel to soldiers who dreamed of climbing the ladder. "Lucky did it first," they would say. Lucky showed us the way. Even men who never met him, who had been children when he was deported, spoke of him with respect as though invoking a founding father. But Luciano's legacy was more than structure, it was philosophy. He had taught the Mafia to think long-term, to act less like street gangs and more like businessmen. He had shifted the vision from local rackets to national enterprises, from neighborhoods to industries, from petty crime to systemic infiltration. Union halls, ports, trucking companies, construction firms, casinos all became the arteries through which Mafia power flowed. Luciano had understood something vital: violence draws attention, but systems create longevity. His successors carried that wisdom forward, expanding the Mafia into realms he himself might never have imagined. Yet there was irony in this legacy. For all his genius in building the Commission, the Mafia would eventually become a victim of the very structure he had designed. Law enforcement, once scattered and uncoordinated, began to study the Commission as carefully as the men who sat on it. By the late 20th century, federal prosecutors used Luciano's model against the Mafia, proving in court that the families were not random gangs but part of a single organization. The RICO Act of 1970, designed to dismantle organized crime, owed much of its strength to the idea that the Mafia was structured like a corporation, an idea born from Luciano's reforms. In trying to make the Mafia untouchable, he had also made it identifiable. Still, history is not measured only in victories or defeats. It is measured in influence, in echoes. And Luciano's echoes stretch across decades. In movies, he became a character, a symbol of the quintessential gangster, cunning, ruthless, yet strangely honorable. Films like The Godfather carried his fingerprints, not in literal accuracy, but in spirit. The commission meetings in smoky backrooms, the balance of power between families, the idea of crime as a kind of business dynasty, all of it stemmed from Luciano's original blueprint. When audiences watched those films, they were not just seeing fiction, they were seeing the shadow of Luciano's vision dramatized. Beyond cinema, his legacy lived in the streets. Even after his death, the drug routes he was rumored to have shaped continued to pump narcotics into American cities. The casinos in Havana and later in Las Vegas bore traces of his early investments. The alliances he forged between Italians and Jews in the underworld set a precedent for cooperation that outlived its founders. Luciano had shown that organized crime was not about ethnicity or old-world feuds, it was about money, influence, and control. That pragmatism remained central to the Mafia ethos long after his exile. And then there was the personal legacy, the story of a boy from Lercurafritti, Sicily, who had come to America with nothing and built an empire out of the shadows. His journey embodied the immigrant dream twisted into something darker, the idea that if the system would not give you power, you could create your own. For many immigrants who felt locked out of the American promise, Luciano's story was not just crime, it was survival, ambition, and triumph over a society that had once looked down on them. He became a symbol of possibility, even if that possibility was carved from blood and corruption. At his funeral in Naples, thousands gathered. Some came out of respect, some out of curiosity, and some because they understood they were witnessing the end of an era. The coffin was draped in flowers, the air heavy with incense and whispers. Photographs from that day show a crowd both solemn and fascinated, as if they were not burying a man but sealing a legend into the earth. Later, his body was returned to the United States, fulfilling his final wish to rest on the soil of the country he had once ruled from the shadows. Even in death, Luciano had negotiated his way back to America, the place he could never escape in life. And so, the Commission lived on, its existence a monument to his vision. It would face crackdowns, betrayals, and the relentless pressure of law enforcement, but the system itself endured for decades. In every sit-down, in every whispered oath, in every careful balancing of power between families, Luciano's ghost was present. He had built a machine that could outlast the man who conceived it. Perhaps that is the truest measure of legacy, not wealth, not fear, not even memory, but structure. Luciano had created something that endured beyond him, something that became bigger than any one man. He had turned chaos into order, blood into system, crime into institution. And while lawmen and prosecutors might celebrate the Mafia's decline in later years, the fact remains, without Luciano, there might never have been a Mafia worth destroying. In the end, the story of Lucky Luciano is the story of transformation. He was not the first gangster, nor the most violent, nor even the richest. But he was the one who saw the future. He saw that power was not about territory but about organization, not about fear but about respect, not about chaos but about structure. That vision, ruthless, brilliant, and enduring, became his legacy. And as long as stories are told about the underworld, as long as men gather in darkened rooms to whisper about power, money, and loyalty, the name Lucky Luciano will live on not just as a man, but as the architect of a system that changed the very face of organized crime. Myth has a way of bending truth. Over time, facts dissolve into legend, and men who lived ordinary, flawed lives become larger than themselves. Charles Lucky Luciano was no exception. His name became a myth, a story told in whispers across the neighborhoods of New York, in dimly lit bars in Naples, in casino backrooms in Havana, and even in the hushed corridors of Hollywood studios where writers searched for inspiration. Luciano's life, already extraordinary, was polished by memory until it gleamed with the sheen of inevitability, as if he had always been destined to rise, to rule, to leave behind a shadow that no law could erase. The myth of Luciano began long before his death. Even in the 1930s, when he walked the streets of New York in tailored suits, people saw in him more than just a gangster. They saw an archetype, the immigrant who refused to be broken, the strategist who turned brutality into order. To the public, he was both terrifying and fascinating, the criminal mastermind who seemed untouchable. Newspapers called him the boss of bosses, though he rejected the title. Reporters painted him as the embodiment of the Mafia, a man who pulled the strings of the underworld like a puppeteer. In reality, Luciano had always avoided the spotlight, preferring to rule through consensus, through structures and alliances. But myth rarely concerns itself with accuracy. It concerns itself with symbols. And Luciano had become one. After his conviction in 1936 and his deportation a decade later, the myth only grew stronger. In America, his absence made him larger. To the young street hustlers rising in the Bronx or Brooklyn, Luciano became a ghostly presence, the man who had set the rules they were now living under. They spoke his name with reverence, sometimes with longing. Stories circulated of his supposed control over narcotics pipelines, his alleged connections in Cuba, his influence even from exile. Some of these stories were true, some exaggerated, and some outright fantasy. But together they created a legend far more powerful than reality. In Sicily, where Luciano spent his final years, the myth took a different form. To many Italians, he was the American gangster who had never forgotten his roots, the Sicilian boy who made it big in the New World. In Naples, where he lived quietly but never anonymously, people would point him out in cafes, whispering as he passed. Children grew up hearing his name, adults told tales of his exploits, and his presence gave a strange glamour to the city's underworld. Even those who had no direct dealings with him felt his shadow. He was both a source of pride and a cautionary tale, a man who embodied the risks and rewards of the criminal life. Hollywood did its part to cement Luciano into myth. Though no major film of his lifetime portrayed him directly, elements of his story seeped into the gangster genre. When audiences watched movies about mafia bosses sitting around long tables discussing peace or war like heads of state, they were watching echoes of Luciano's commission. When they saw portrayals of gangsters who balanced brutality with strategy, who combined ruthlessness with vision, they were seeing Luciano's archetype. Later, in documentaries and dramatizations, his image was explicitly invoked. Actors played him with cold intelligence, with charm edged in steel. The screen enlarged his legend, transforming the man into a cultural icon. The myth also found fertile ground in the collective imagination of law enforcement. To prosecutors, Luciano was the benchmark, the figure against whom all other mobsters were measured. They studied his life as if it contained the secret code to organized crime. His very name became shorthand for the Mafia itself. The FBI files were thick with reports, surveillance notes, and speculations, many of which blurred fact and rumor. Some agents came to believe he still ran operations from Exile, that he was the spider at the center of the web, his reach stretching across oceans. Whether true or not, the belief itself gave him a kind of posthumous power. But memory is double-edged. While some revered him, others despised what he symbolized. To victims of extortion, to families torn apart by drugs, to communities hollowed by corruption, Luciano was not a legend but a curse. For them, his myth was built on suffering. The glamour of the Mafia, the romance of the gangster life, obscured the pain inflicted on ordinary people. Yet even this criticism fed the legend, for controversy fuels memory as much as admiration does. The fact that Luciano was hated as much as he was admired only deepened his mythic stature. He was too big to ignore, too complex to simplify. His funeral in Naples became the stage for this myth in its purest form. Thousands came, not because they knew him personally, but because they felt they knew the story. The coffin moving through the streets was less a man's body than a symbol being carried. When his remains were later moved back to New York, buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the myth came full circle. There he lay among other Mafia figures, his grave visited by those who sought a connection to history, by the curious, the reverent, and even the tourists who wanted to glimpse the final resting place of a legend. The stone bore his name, but around it hovered the countless stories, true and false, that gave that name its weight. Memory also transformed Luciano into something larger than organized crime. He became a lens through which people understood power, ambition, and corruption. Writers compared him to Machiavelli, to Caesar, to modern CEOs. He was not merely a gangster, he was a case study in leadership, in the manipulation of systems, in the creation of order from chaos. His myth lived not only in the underworld but in academia, in sociology classes, in discussions about immigrant identity, capitalism, and the American dream's dark underside. And so Luciano became eternal not because of what he truly was, but because of what people believed him to be. Myth and memory had fused, creating a figure who transcended his own life. For some, he was the ultimate gangster. For others, the immigrant who clawed his way to the top. For still others, the cautionary tale of ambition without morality. Each generation reshaped him according to its own fears and desires. In this way, he never died. His myth continues to live wherever stories of power and corruption are told, wherever the line between legend and reality blurs. This, perhaps, is the greatest paradox of Lucky Luciano's life. The man himself was flesh and blood, ambitious, clever, ruthless, flawed. But the memory of him became something else, a mirror in which people see what they want to see. A symbol of power for the powerless. A villain for the victims. A hero for those who romanticize rebellion. In the end, the truth mattered less than the story. And the story, like the man who inspired it, proved impossible to kill.